Welcome back to 20th Century Philosophy. Lectures 4 and 5 from Russell can be a little bit challenging if you don't have any background in either psychology or physics. He's talking about causation, both in terms of the way the past events affect present action in terms of psychology, and then also in terms of physics, in terms of the causal events of physical objects. At the beginning of Lecture 4, Russell spends a fair amount of time discussing the relation of past to present action. And this can be puzzling because it seems fairly uncontroversial, and also seems like he spent a lot of time talking about this when he talked about habit. So why is he bringing this back up? And it's important to remember that Russell's analysis here of the mind is in contrast to previous analyses of the mind, or ways of thinking about the mind, in terms of consciousness. So Locke very famously talked about the mind and talked about memory in terms of re-experiencing the past, that in order to connect the present to the past, you had to have a conscious experience of the past. And Russell wants to get rid of that analysis in terms of consciousness. He's offering a third-person analysis of the mind in terms primarily of behavior. And so he needs to somehow connect present action to past events, even though the past is no longer around. So how is the past affecting the present if it's not through consciousness? And to do this, Russell hits on this idea of mnemic phenomena. And he defines mnemic phenomena as behavior that can only be explained by including past experiences of the organism as part of the cause. And these are his exact words on page 55. Responses can only be brought under causal laws by including past occurrences in the history of the organism as part of the causes of the present response. So if we're going to try to explain what you're doing right now, the only way we can explain it is by thinking about what kinds of things happened in the past. That is what he's eventually going to argue is what constitutes the mind, that the mind has these mnemic phenomena in relation to it, in relation to an explanation of what the mind is doing, and this is what is going to distinguish the mental from the physical, as we'll talk about later in the lecture. So some examples that he gives us then in terms of what mnemic phenomena are. Habit we've already talked about, and he refers back to the cat who's in the maze and gets better and better at the maze by virtue of experience in the maze. And we can only explain that better experience when you put the cat in. It's the same maze, same cat, same stimulus. What's different is that the cat has learned, and we can only explain the improved behavior in going through the maze in terms of the cat's past experience. Other examples, images are going to be very important, and Russell talks about an image. He'll define an image as a copy of a past experience, a past sensation, more specifically. And so, think about images, and one of the questions with respect to images are whether they have to be conscious. If you're having an image right now of, say, an apple, is that necessarily a conscious image, or are there other ways that we might think about what an image is as a copy of a past sensation that may or may not involve this kind of conscious experience of the past sensation? Another example is association, and here is kind of any way in which experiences are connected together. All kinds of associations are possible between experience. He talks also about purely physical associations, so stimulus and response kinds of associations, where you get a stimulus and that then gets associated with a certain kind of response. Non-sensational perception is a really interesting example, and this is where you get a particular sensation, but your past experience fills in information about that object, about what's going on, that isn't contained in the sensation. So he talks about the way in which a coin looks elliptical to you, and coin is a little too small to use as an image here. So I've got my 100-year-old Sony Walkman. So it's obviously round if we look at it flat, but even if we looked at it from an angle and what you're actually seeing is an ellipse here, you still would see it as round. If I just went like this and then showed you this, say what shape is this, Walkman, and you would say it's round. And that information is not contained in the sensations. And later he'll talk about the distinction between sensation and perception. And one of the distinctions is the way this non-sensory experience fills in your sensations in order to allow you to interpret the world. Other ways the past is influence in the present is through memory, where memory is a kind of conscious experience of the past, and we'll have a whole lecture on that later in the book. And then just generally experience, and he talks about experience as any past event that modifies present behavior. So think about these kinds of examples. Look for them in your own experience, in your own daily life. What are examples of mnemic phenomena, things that can't be explained in terms of what's going on right here in the present? What requires the past to explain what's going on in the present? Does it clearly distinguish between the physical and the mental in the way that Russell thinks that it does? The analysis of mnemic phenomena then leads to Russell's definition of what mnemic causation is, where approximate cause includes the past event. So what's going on to cause an action is something that includes the mnemic phenomena, this past experience that contributes to what my behavior is in the present. A mnemic causal law then, he discusses on page 60, and this is a quote: if a complex stimulus A has caused a complex reaction B in an organism, the occurrence of a part of A on a future occasion tends to cause the whole reaction B. So when you have an event happening that is like this past event, then any aspect of it is going to cause the similar reaction in order to be able to make this connection. So you can't have a whole cause of the past. So when the cat goes into the maze, not absolutely everything is identical to the previous event, but enough of it is. It's the same maze, it's the same critical relations that cause the cat to be able to move through the maze in a faster sort of way. So some part of the past event is what is contributing to this reaction that allows the cat to behave appropriately in this situation. So this is the mnemic causal law. And in terms of thinking about this causal law, like what exactly explains how the past is having this effect? And throughout this lecture, Russell wants to keep it open about whether mnemic causation and mnemic phenomena are purely physical, or whether there could be some other purely sort of mental way of describing what mnemic phenomena are. His theory is called anomalous monism because it's a monism, but it's anomalous. It's not clear exactly what the substance is that is explaining all of metaphysics. And that will be a question that we continue to raise throughout this analysis. So he wants to keep it open exactly what mnemic phenomena are, but he's open to the idea that it's a physical phenomenon, namely that it might be something called an engram, which is where the brain stores information about experience as modifications of the nerves. So it may be Russell is open to, to considering that something's going on in the brain whereby the mnemic phenomena are stored. Some kind of change in the brain maybe is what accounts for this capacity of the past to affect the future. He's not going completely on board with the engram theory, but he's open to this possibility. And it's useful to think in contemporary terms about how the engram theory is cashed out, and we can think of it in terms of Hebbian synapses. I always like to get a little bit of neuroscience into my philosophy courses because I think understanding the brain is really important to life as we live it, and it's difficult to really understand what a brain is and how a brain functions unless you know a little bit about the basic mechanism. So here's a picture of an axon, a neuron, and it is shown here connecting with the next dendrite of the next neuron in a synapse. So you've got this big sort of fist-like axon that goes right next to the next neuron, and what happens is that chemicals, when a neuron fires, when it's stimulated, it'll fire and it'll send chemicals into the synapse, and those then will get absorbed into the next neuron. And if enough chemicals get absorbed into the next neuron, then it will fire and send the message along down the line. So what happens in learning is that these neurons that fire together, as they say, wire together. And so eventually a particular stimulus will form a kind of pattern of neurons in the brain that then is learning. And so that's how the past is encoded. Your past learning gets encoded in your brain through the complex patterns of activation in the brain along these different neuron channels. It's sort of like the way that a path gets formed in the snow in the winter. One person walks along, and then the next person walks along, and then the next person, until you have a very deep path. And learning is similar to that. You form very deep paths, and the more you do things over and over again, the deeper the path becomes. So it's not exactly the engram theory, which is a kind of storage of the past experience and then replaying. That was an old view of the way memory works. It's much more malleable than that in terms of how the past functions, because there's so many different pathways, and the same neuron gets connected to lots of different things, not just to one single sort of thing. So the way we think about the role of the past on the present is different from the engram theory, although sometimes people still use this concept of an engram in terms of thinking about how the brain stores past information.